All right, everyone. Welcome to our second AIH seminar of the year. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Alice Wong, who is a computational data scientist with research interests applied to questions in neuroscience. Her projects include a wide variety of things, including the cognitive neuroscience of the human sense of agency, as well as investigating the sense of agency with brain stimulation, the temporal dynamics of voluntary action, the cognitive impact of psychedelic substances, and human random behavior. So please join me today in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Alice Wong.
So thanks for that very kind introduction. I am actually going to not be talking about any of that today because that doesn't relate to AI. So today I will be asking a series of questions that will be basically hopefully outlining a path to comparing the capabilities of AI to humans. So the headline question I've chosen for today is what happens when you simulate an algorithm? Okay, there we go. So yeah, this is the outline for today's talk. In part A, I will be asking these questions. When does a simulation give you the same consequences as the simulant? And question 2, what happens when you simulate an implemented algorithm? And then in part B, I will be drawing more on neuroscience and mechanistic interpretability research to answer the questions, do biological brains, such as the ones humans like us have, do those implement algorithms? And then do the modern deep learning-based AIs implement algorithms? So some of the philosophical themes that you'll see in this talk involve the nature of computation, functionalism, substrate neutrality or flexibility, multiple realizability, and the uses and misuses of metaphor, analogy, and simulation. I won't really be using those terms, but you can see those themes in the questions and the way that I've asked the questions. What this talk will not be about, it will not be about the simulation hypothesis. So I am not asking the question, is our current physical reality as we know it, is that a simulation? That's an interesting question in and of itself. Lots of interesting thought and research on that. But I am interested in, with our current reality, with our currently known laws of physics, what can we simulate? And can we create AIs that would maybe be as functionally similar to humans in terms of consciousness, in terms of other capabilities? Yeah, and I don't think we'll get to there, but if we have extra time, we can maybe start thinking about how we might want to avoid creating consciousness in AI. But yeah, so as motivation for why I'm asking these questions, in philosophy, ideally, you start from true premises, obviously true premises, and then you make some arguments, and then you come to an unobvious conclusion. That's the general structure of philosophical arguments. And ideally, I would have phrased each of these questions as premises, as obviously true premises. The problem is these are not commonly taken as obviously true premises right now. So that's why they're phrased as questions that I would go through. But these are the questions phrased as statements. So at the end of the talk, if I have convinced you of what I'm about to say, then you would agree with me that a simulatee can have the same nth consequence as its simulant. I'll explain the terms later. With regards to the second question, you would agree that when you simulate an algorithm, you get another algorithm, which may or may not be the same as the first one, but you get another algorithm. And then the next two questions would be, you would agree that biological brains do implement algorithms with electrical and biochemical circuits. And then number 4 is you would agree that deep learning-based AIs implement algorithms. Yeah, and this is generally why I'm trying to do this, because it's unintuitive how we go from the brain to the mind. It's also sort of unintuitive right now how we go from hardware, modern hardware computers, to the AIs that we know of right now, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini. And then if we're trying to compare the two of them, human capabilities and AIs, then you get confusion squared. So the obviously true is the hard part here. I'm trying to make this more obviously true, hopefully. So yeah, the aim of this talk is simply to establish these premises as true, and then we can go from there to talk about why this would be bad for humans. The second motivation as to why I framed the questions these way is because I was reading this book recently, this year, on its 30th anniversary. There's a book called Permutation City. It's a sci-fi fictional novel. And there was a very interesting phrasing in this question, where in chapter 3, they started talking about the AI hypothesis. So you can see that these questions as to what consciousness might or might not be able to be simulated. They're pretty old questions, but the book asked whether, or the book's one of the characters said that simulated consciousness was as oxymoronic as simulated addition, which then led me to the question, is simulated addition actually an oxymoron? Because nowadays we have ways of training AI where instead of simply doing addition the way you would with creating an electrical circuit and logic gates, you give it numbers and then it learns to predict the outcome of an addition question. Is that process simulating algorithm, or is it actually implementing algorithm? I think that was a very interesting question. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be using the words simulating and modeling basically interchangeably. So yeah, common replies to the question, can we simulate consciousness? The most common example comes up with hurricanes. Opponents reply that when you model a hurricane, nobody gets wet. Yeah, that's true. When you model a fusion plant, nuclear energy, no actual energy is produced. So then when you model the human brain, why should you expect real thought to occur? And my answer will come later, but it's essentially because thought is an algorithm, and when you model an algorithm, there's a special property about algorithms. And just to kind of bring things to the modern day, just to show that these questions are still relevant 30 years later, people are still talking about this question of, can we get conscious AI or not? The people who don't think we can get conscious AI basically point to the same sorts of arguments, saying that maybe we do need a biological substrate for consciousness to occur in the same way that you need water molecules for hurricanes to occur. So starting with part A, I'm going to be talking about the metaphysical possibility of simulating consciousness or other algorithms. But first, I'll start with the question. When does a simulation get you the same consequences as the simulant? So when people talk about hurricane simulators, this is usually what they're thinking about when they say X depends on the presence of Y, as in wetness depends on the presence of water molecules. Okay.
Of normally dry ground, water is already life-threatening. It's too late to evacuate. Water this high can knock you off your feet, make cars float, and driving impossible.
Oops. Yeah. So that was an example of what people usually think about when they're thinking about simulators. In the US recently, there were some large floods and hurricanes in Florida, maybe somewhere. Yeah. But basically, you would all agree that this computer or the TV that's showing the simulation of the hurricane is not actually getting any water inside it. That's fine, that's true. But then I want to ask the question, I want us to think about carefully, why do we not get wind and rain inside this simulation? And for that, I propose this useful framework that I've found useful, so maybe it will be helpful to other people as well, where you ask a series of questions and you think carefully about what is the thing you are simulating, which is what I'm calling the simuland, the thing doing the simulating, which is the simulator, and then the thing that a simulator gives you, which I'm calling the simulatee. There are other words for it out there in the literature, like simulacra, simulacrum, by some pretty known philosophers, but those terms come with a little bit of baggage about whether it represents reality truly or not. I just wanted a term that means the thing a simulator gives you without any attachment to whether this thing is true to reality or not. So those are the terms. And then I propose that if you ask these theory questions, we can start to figure out when a simulator would or would not give you the same consequence as the simulant, the thing you are simulating. So the first question is, what is the physical structure and material of the simulant, the simulator, and the simulatee? What is the whatever consequence of your simulant, simulator, and simulatee? And then which part of the physical structure and material causes the consequence? So applied to the typical hurricane simulator, this is what it would look like. So let's say you are trying to simulate Hurricane Milton. The thing you are simulating is an actual hurricane, like Hurricane Milton, which has moving ions. It's made of water molecules, and there's air that's being blown around in this real hurricane. If you're simulating this real hurricane with a computer, what is the computer? What is the physical structure and material of a computer? Computers have electricity in them. They're made of crystal quartz, or the CPU clock is, and then whatever electrical components, some of them made of silicone, etc. And then the simulatee, what is the thing that the simulator gives you? That's a computer program and its outputs, which can sometimes just be another computer program. So that's essentially what this looks like. This simulatee here is a computer program being simulated by a computer. This is all pretty normal, I would say. Nothing too crazy here. So then we look at the next question. What is the nth consequence of the thing? So what is the consequence of Hurricane Milton, the real hurricane? If you stand in it, you will get wet. And if you have a piece of paper, you're holding a piece of paper in it, then it will also get blown away, probably. What is the consequence of computers doing its thing? Well, computers mainly move around electricity. So in their circuits, they're moving electricity from one place to another. And then sometimes they will also make light diodes. Certain light diodes light up a certain way or not, and then that's what you see on your monitor. And then what's the consequence of a simulatee? So talking about this hurricane simulator now. What is the physical consequence of a computer running its program? One is just the same thing. electricity gets routed between different circuits. Lights change on your monitor. But another consequence is that we humans look at the outputs and then make certain decisions based on the outputs. So if the simulator said the hurricane path is going to go east versus west, then we send out evacuation notices accordingly. Yeah, so that's all pretty normal, hopefully. I haven't said anything crazy. Now I want to ask you, when would you actually get wind and rain inside a hurricane simulator? So for that, I'd like to show you this thing in Florida University. They call it the wall of wind.
They're able to create what kind of a hurricane are we talking about?
Well, we can create up to a Category 5 hurricane wind speeds over 157 miles per hour.
Right now, what we're testing is transmission lines for power. And that's important because, of course, we all depend on electricity as homes go all electric more and more, right? Those things can create what I think is a very laminar flow, which is interesting to us because in homes, we're very kind of concerned with airflow measurements. And airflow is the hardest thing to measure because it's squirrely. It kind of goes all over the place. But here you can make it go perfectly straight. And I stepped into the flow and out of it. Is that your goal?
Our goal is to certainly focus the wind towards the turntable where the structure is. But a hurricane wind is not nice and straight and laminar and smooth. It's actually very turbulent. We have engineered in.
So that's another type of simulator that you can have. And I think it's clear that if you stand in this particular hurricane simulator, you would get wet and you would get blown away if you were light enough. So then the question is, what is the difference? Why in this simulator you would get wet and in the computer simulator you wouldn't get wet?
They're able to create what kind of a hurricane are we talking about?
Well,
So then coming back to this framework again, if we break it down, it kind of becomes clear why you get wet in this simulator and not in the previous one. So again, we have the simuland, the thing we're simulating, Hurricane Milton, same thing. This time our simulator is the wall of wind, which is commonly referred to as a physical simulation. But I don't really like that term because all simulations, in a sense, are physical simulations. Computers are not magical, non-physical items. They are very physical, actually. They produce a lot of heat. It's just that what they physically do is usually hidden from us. It's also too small for us to see. Electricity and circuits. What we do see is the lights changing on a monitor. So yeah. And then if you use the Florida's wall of wind to simulate a hurricane, the simulatee looks like a small scale hurricane, which also gets you wet and windblown. So yeah, this is just another way to say that with the wall of wind as the simulator, the consequence of getting wet and getting windblown is the same as the simulant when you have a real hurricane. And then everything here applies just as well. Even the simulatee will get you wet and will get you blown away. And now, if we just tweak this a little bit, and this is where we come into the thought experiment territory. So imagine with the wall of wind, we didn't use water specifically. We used maybe orange juice, which is a different substance to what's in a real hurricane. Would you still get wet from the simulatee? Hopefully it's clear that yes, if you put orange juice in the pipes of the wall of wind simulator, you would get wet. And then the next thought experiment is, what if you used liquid mercury instead? So mercury has this property of not being absorbable by towels and things like that. So in that particular scenario, would you get wet still? You'd get pelted by liquid mercury, but does that count as wet? It depends on what you meant by wet, but that's not a new question. But I just wanted to present these sorts of thought experiments to illustrate that you can get the same consequence, like a simulatee can produce the same consequence as a simuland in specific circumstances. It just depends on what is the simuland. So yeah, so answering the question, when would you get wet inside a weather or a hurricane simulation? We have this intuition that when people say something is simulated or is virtual or is digital, this means that it is not real and it is not physical. But why? Why do we think that? I think that when you simulate the weather with roughly the same stuff, and by stuff I just mean the material and the structure of the weather, what you get basically the same consequence. So the upshot, the take-home message of this particular section is simply that you shouldn't dismiss a simulation of some original simuland X as unable to produce the same consequence of X based solely on the fact that it is a simulation. So this applies to the AI scenario where just because AI might be simulating consciousness or simulating human brains, that doesn't mean that it might not actually be conscious. Yeah, so as a summary of this question, we have a couple ways to get a simulation that would give you the same consequence as the simulant. You can simulate using the same stuff as the simulant, or you can simulate with stuff that has the same relevant consequences as the simulant. So for the next question, what happens when you simulate an algorithm? And this started off as a metaphysical type of question, but as of 2024, all of my examples have now moved into physical reality. You can buy the devices that I talk about now. So yeah, the passage of time helps. So I started off talking about hurricanes. So ideally, this question would be, what happens when you try to simulate an algorithm for hurricane? But that's kind of hard to visualize. So instead, I'm making it what happens when you try to simulate a recipe for cake. So here I'm using algorithm and recipe interchangeably. And then instead of hurricane, we're going to talk about cakes for a while. So looking at this framework again, I want you to just take a second or two to think about how would you simulate a recipe for cake? And then here is one way. Here is a baking simulation. So you can see here that no matter how high resolution your baking simulator is, you won't get any cakes at the end of this. This is the same way that people say you don't get wet from a hurricane, a simulated digital hurricane. That's fine. But I want you to take a look very carefully about the recipe. What about the recipe in this baking simulation? What do you notice about it? So here on screen, we have simulated flour, simulated strawberries, simulated butter, a simulated phone with a simulated recipe, and some simulated words. If anyone here knows about baking cakes, you might notice that all of these ingredients and all of the proportion of the ingredients are pretty much accurate. If you actually baked a cake with this recipe, you would get a real strawberry cake. So then the second scenario, what happens if you use a simulated recipe with non-simulated cake ingredients? So let's say you put on an Apple Vision Pro and lets you bring up a simulated recipe in your Vision, which is not there in what we normally call reality. There won't be a floating pane with the recipe, but you can see it with the simulation from the Apple Vision Pro. And then you go about getting the regular flour, the regular butter, strawberries, and then you bake a cake according to that recipe. The answer clearly is you will get an edible cake. You will get a real cake. So even though the recipe might be simulated, the thing, the recipe's outputs, the algorithm's outputs, that can still be very real. And then to kind of make this maximally clear in the third scenario, what happens when the simulant happens to be a recipe or algorithm in the real world? So you might have heard that recently in the US, I don't know if this is true for other countries as well, but they have started to ban phone use in schools because it's distracting and things like that. That's really cool and fine. But then also this year, Apple came out with this function where essentially you can now, they call it mirroring, but they are simulating your phone on your computer. So then now what happens? I can just show a quick demonstration of this. So this is now my personal computer. Here is the iPhone mirroring app. And straight up, if you open it, this is what my phone looks like. And you know it's a simulation. Like the battery level does not match the battery level of my actual computer. But don't be confused. The computer is simulating the phone. It's not a copy. Because when you look at what happens when you open the camera, where are the computations coming from? Where is the input output? Well, Apple doesn't actually let you use the camera because that could be bad, but the camera would come from the phone's camera. So I think it's pretty commonly agreed that phones run algorithms. That's probably not really disputed. And now we have a computer that is simulating a phone. So does it matter that we have now banned phone use? Like students put away their phones in lockers and we're not. But if they have an iPhone and a MacBook, what are we going to do about the simulation of the phone? Are we going to try and ban computer use? That is a little bit harder to argue for because I would say in 2024, like we are, you have to develop computer skills, and it takes time and practice to develop a skill. So if you ban computer use wholesale until university, let's say, that's the pros and cons there are harder to argue for. But the point here is that this is the clearest, I would say, clearest example of how simulating an algorithm gets you another algorithm. So it has the same consequence. Like using the simulated phone on my MacBook is basically the same as using my actual phone. And then we can ask the question, when does a simulation stop being a mere simulation, which is usually the way people think about it? They think if it's a simulated thing, then it's not as something as the original. I think the critical question that you would need to ask is, can the simulatee, that is the thing that a simulator gives you, can that simulatee affect the part of the world that is outside its simulator? So in this case, with the MacBook and the iPhone, the world outside its simulator would be things like the person looking at the phone. If they get just as distracted as when they look at the simulated phone, as opposed to the real phone, then its effect is the same. Yeah, so this is just a summary of this part. I talked about first the baking simulator, where everything is simulated, including the cake ingredients and the recipe. In the second scenario, we have just the recipe being simulated, but the cake ingredients are real. And then the third, we have the thing where the original simulant is itself an algorithm. And then from there, we know that if the thing originally is an algorithm, then the simulatee can give you exactly the same consequence. And so I just want how this relates to AI is that when we talk about simulations, people generally think about the outputs, like the cakes and the hurricanes. What about the recipe simulators? What if we did something like we wrote the recipe for a strawberry cake on a blueberry cake? Does that mean that when we follow the recipe, we won't still get a strawberry cake? No. I think we would still get a strawberry cake. And this means that even if AIs, however they were doing their simulations, even if it is a simulation of consciousness, we don't have to run it on biological substrates for it to have the same consequence. So yeah, this is the summary of the second question. What happens when you simulate an algorithm? You get another algorithm. And this affects the first question in terms of when does a simulation get you the same consequence as the simulant? The first two answers we had talked about the material of the simulant, but if your simulant is already itself an algorithm, then you don't really care about the material because the relevant consequences of an algorithm do not usually relate to the material. Yeah. So in summary, the take-home message for part A is simply have this structure in mind and ask these questions when you are thinking about simulations. What is the thing you are simulating? What is the thing doing the simulating? And then what is the structure of the thing that the simulator gives you? And just to end this part with a little bit of humor, there are very certain circumstances where the material of an algorithm or a recipe becomes relevant. It's rare, but it happens.
Huh? Emma.
Not anymore.
Emma.
Every day it's getting on my nerves.
Emma.
Oh, I'm
Emma.
begging you, please.
Emma.
Leave me alone.
So yes, I want to say that 99% of the time, the material of your algorithm where it's being run on does not matter, but there is a 1% of the time where it does. The question is, can we figure out where the 1% is?
Emma.
Okay, so moving on to part B. I've talked about what is physically possible. Now I want to talk about what is actually the case. So there are many types of things that can be physically possible, but might not be the actual case in the current time. So what I mean by this is there are many, for example, physically possible types of computer chips, let's say. But when computer chip designers create computers, they only choose a couple of the possible configurations, of the physically possible configurations to actually make. And I mean, which ones they choose depend on a variety of factors, economics, efficiency, whatever. But now I want to talk about the actual part. So there are different ways biological brains could physically be wired up. Which ones are the ones that we have actually? I'm just going to skip this. So starting with a little bit of biology first about brains. Biological brains are made of neurons. These neurons conduct electrical signals, and electrical signals come from the movement of chemicals and ions. So here are some examples of what that looks like or sounds like.
The researchers actually listened in to individual nerve cells firing in the anesthetized cat as they presented it with different visual images.
When we started working, Torsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make the cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen, and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day, we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen. And we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response.
So these are just some examples of really early neuroscience work where we started to peer into the biological brain, and we found out that they, in fact, do conduct electricity and in specific patterns. So here is another interesting pattern.
Look at this spectrum. Gorgeous. Notice anything odd? All the colours you could possibly imagine. Except, where's magenta? It's not there. Why then do we see it? Our brains are squishy, mushy information processors. They convert the billions of events going on around us into signals we can make sense of. The brain allows us to interpret these signals as sounds, smells, and so on. One of the things going on outside your head is the electromagnetic field. There are waves of energy that ripple across this field. The frequency of these waves determines a range of effects. Some can reheat your soup, and others show your bones. The best ones broadcast the breakfast show. We humans can only detect a tiny smidgen of these wavelengths with our bodies, most through our eyes, and some through our sunburns. The wavelengths we see through our eyes we call visible light. Why we detect just this narrow band of waves is up for debate, but we do know that EM waves between 400 to 700 nanometers, or the visible light spectrum, are the only wavelengths that travel easily through water. It also happens to be the part of the EM spectrum that the sun emits the most of. Given our early ancestors lived in the sea and were illuminated by the sun, it makes sense that we would evolve to detect the most common and useful wavelengths in the EM spectrum. Our eyes detect colour via specialised cone cells. There are 3 types of cone cell in the human eye. One's to detect short wavelengths, the blues, one to detect medium wavelengths, the greens, and one to detect long wavelengths, the reds. But we see more than just red, green and blue. The cone cells in your eyes overlap in the wavelengths they detect. Look at this chart. You can see that when a ray of light with a wavelength of 570 nanometers enters your eye, it stimulates both the long and medium cones. Their responses are combined and sent along the optic nerve as one signal. And it's this signal that we interpret as yellow light. An odd quirk of this system is that when two beams of light at the exact same ratio enter the eye, the signal that is sent off to the brain is the same. These two combined light rays also cause us to see yellow. The screen that you are watching this on takes advantage of the way our brain perceives colour. If you look closely, you can see that screens are composed of small clusters of just red, green and blue lights, yet your display can produce the whole spectrum. Every colour that we perceive can be generated via this dual route, a single wavelength of light or a combination of wavelengths that stimulate our cones in the same manner. Except one. Magenta. There is no wavelength of light for magenta. Instead, we perceive it only when the S cones and L cones pick up a signal from pure red and blue light. Our brains literally make up magenta. Why? We don't know. It's probably quite useful though, given that much of our early primate ancestors were in green forests. Magenta fruits and flowers would have had the highest contrast against a green background, making it easy for our ancestors to find a tasty snack. Our brain does all kinds of these bizarre cognitive leaps all the time. You might be surprised just how much of the world around you isn't exactly as it appears.
So that, I would say, is kind of the easiest to understand example of how our brains implement algorithms that then generate our conscious experience. You might notice from this that, for example, if you didn't know about magenta, or if you do know about magenta, you now know that if someone shows you a picture of a rainbow and they say it's a real rainbow that was created by splitting white light physically, if there's magenta in that rainbow, then it was a deepfake. But that requires a little bit of knowing about the physical world, yes, but also the human brain and how it perceives things. So sometimes when I look at the conversation on AI and what it can or cannot do in comparison to human capabilities, it's pretty easy to figure out who has what sort of background, whether they come from a more CS only or a more psychology/neuroscience background, depending on which side gets overhyped. And you might have noticed that the video said in a way that our brains make up magenta. Another word you might use is maybe we hallucinate magenta as well as every other color. And I want you to think about this in relation to what large language models and AIs do. 99% of the time, they generate decent looking, reasonably accurate output. The 1% of the time when they don't, people, it makes the news headlines saying that, oh, LLMs are just making things up. But I want you to think about, is that different to what our brains do when we look at colors? I would say no, but there's an argument there. And just to really hammer in this point that our brains implement algorithms, there's an example here that I can induce the perception of magenta in you without showing you anything that would normally be considered magenta colored. So here we have a screen with green circles. What I'm gonna do is just sequentially move the gray area. So I will remove each one of the green in sequence. And I want you to focus your eyes on the fixation cross in the middle. only stare at that, try not to move your eyes, and then tell me if you see a color or something moving around your periphery. But make sure your eyes stay in the middle. So there isn't much time. I won't actually ask you what the color was, but it should have looked something like this, which is close to magenta. You may ask, why does this happen? There is a neuroscience explanation, and I won't go into it today because there isn't much time. But this is just to hammer in the point that your brains are physical brains. We are starting to understand some of the algorithms that are implemented in our brains, but we do not know everything. But of the small part that we do know, it's already enough to tell us that it works in systematic ways. So this is some parts of the color algorithm that we know. And it's the way that our brains implement algorithms seem to be very similar to the way that the modern AIs are implementing their algorithms. There's another clearer example of a brain implementing an algorithm if you look at the fly brain.
Both Larry and I are honored to be presenting here.
This is a clearer example because with the fly brain, we now have the entire map of the fly brain, as in it has 130 something thousand neurons. Scientists have now mapped every single one of those neurons. It takes a lot of work, and the fly is much smaller than the human brain. So we are still a little bit away from mapping the entire human brain, but a fly at least is still a biological brain. And from this map, people are starting to be able to extract out the algorithms. So I think that is also a strong argument in favor of the premise that biological brains implement algorithms.
Signals and deliver it to the H delta Bs, which is what we need.
Okay, so to summarize the third question, do biological brains implement algorithms? Basically, my answer is if you look at the neuroscience research, yes. We're starting to find out that our brains are implementing algorithms using electrical and biochemical circuits. The last question I might have to just skip because of time constraints, but basically the point here is also that there is now research looking at the internals of large language model type AIs or transformers. And this one is a small one, but when they looked at the internals, they also found an algorithm. So this is what the algorithm, a transformer that was trained to do modular addition looks like. It looks nothing like the hardware because the computer that runs an AI also has algorithms implemented in its circuit. And these two look nothing like each other. So now we know that's possible. This has kind of implications for the AI human value alignment in the sense that we have some data that was generated by an original algorithm. They trained a model. This model learned some different algorithm. How this relates to the human case is that if we continue using the same AIs to do this, it might not end well because in the best case scenario, let's say you have one human which generates some sort of data. Let's say we were able to predict, or we had some data set where we knew everything that this person thought, this person felt, this person did. This is an unrealistic scenario, but let's say we had that data set. If we trained a model on that data set to predict the next thing that one person would feel, think, do, whatever, it is entirely possible that this AI will learn to implement a different algorithm than the algorithm that the human's brain was using to generate their feelings, actions, thoughts. This is not good news if we want AIs to do similar things to the human brain. Yeah. So that's the end of the talk. Sorry, I had to skip most of question 4, but hopefully I presented the arguments for questions 1, 2, and 3, and maybe the premises now seem obviously true to you if they didn't before. And yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah, so I agree with you. I think the crucial question, though, is how specific do you think an algorithm needs to be? So, for example, with the mechanistic interpretability research, so this is sorry, I'm just looking for the okay. So this algorithm that they presented is already more of a general algorithm. If you wanted to get specific about the particular algorithm that won, so they trained like 32 plus models. Each model uses a different key frequency to implement this algorithm. So you can see here, there are some numbers here. So the mainline model that's mentioned in the paper uses cosine of 14, cosine of 35, cosine of 41, etc., as its mainline, as its key frequencies to do the computation of the algorithm that was in the previous picture. When they retrain, or when they train a different model that was initiated from different random weights, you can see that the key frequencies change. So sometimes it's 17, 30, 43, 49. Other times it's 14, 15, 26, whatever. So yes, in a sense that they call this the Fourier algorithm. In a sense, all of the transformer models are implementing a Fourier transformation algorithm, but each particular model is using different key frequencies. Would you say they are still kind of implementing the same one? I would say yes, to a certain extent. And then now you ask the question for humans. Do we know that our brains are implementing exactly the same key frequencies, or in neural terms, we usually call these like oscillations? We know that no, each person has a different set of neural oscillations. But does that mean that we are not all computing something like color with the same general algorithm? That is yes. So it really just depends on how specific does the algorithm for consciousness need to be. If something like the Fourier transform algorithm is enough, then like all of these models do that. But if it requires, for example, something like cosine of 14 specifically, then only some of the models use key frequencies cosine of 14. Other ones, they don't have cosine of 14. Yeah, so it just depends on what is the specificity space. Yes. So I do think, let's see, I have a slide that might illustrate my point. Okay. So yes, I agree with you that generally when we use the word algorithm, we're talking about the abstract representational object. In the same way that you might think of the number pi. The number pi is a mathematical object. It has an infinite number of decimal points after it. So there's no, in a sense, real implemented pi value, because once you have any physical circle, you have some value of pi. You can calculate the circumference, the diameter, and then get some value of the implemented pi. But it may be more precise or less precise, closer to the mathematical representation or not. But the thing that I think is important when it comes to comparing AIs with humans, AI capabilities, with human capabilities, is that assuming you agree humans are conscious and other things, we have physical brains that we now know. Neuroscience taught us that. So once you have the physical thing, you know that there is some algorithm implemented in it. It might not be the cleanest or the pure abstraction, the same way that a physical pi will not implement the mathematical value of pi perfectly. But once it's physical, it's implemented and it's there. So then you can simulate it. And then it becomes a question of how close in precision is the simulation to the original thing? And then the point of the first question is that was to show that theoretically, the simulation of the original thing can have the same consequence as the original thing. And then at that point, the conclusion that AIs could be as conscious as humans. So I guess the key point is always as something as humans. So whatever it is that we're doing with our lovely physical brains, it can be simulated. I think you could, and that's because of what the thing you are trying to simulate is. So assuming that you think the human brain is conscious, what is the human brain made of and what is it doing? So if you look at this framework that I proposed, let's say the simulant is the human brain. The simulator is some computer. What is the thing that a human brain does? The human brain basically routes around electricity across different parts. And how does it route around the electricity? We do it using biochemical proteins and other things, neurotransmitters and things like that. But the reason why we have chemicals moving around is because it allows electricity to jump from one neuron to the other. So in that sense, a computer does the same thing. It also routes around electricity. It might not be routing that electricity around using biochemical proteins or things like that. It uses metallic elements, but there's already at least 1/2 of what the brain does that is using the same sort of physical structure and material. So I'm not sure if that's enough, if just routing around electricity is enough for consciousness or not. I lean towards yes, just because of when you think about what happens with people who have brain death or heart death. Basically, we used to think that when the heart stops, people die. But now we know that we can keep almost every other organ alive, the whole body alive even. But if the brain is not actively sending electrical signals around, then they are brain dead, which is currently in this day and age also just known as dead. So yeah, when I think about that example, the difference between a person right before their brain electrical activity dies and right after, what is the difference? Like in, let's say, 1 or 2 minutes, the chemicals don't really have that much time to disappear from your body, but the electricity has stopped. So in that sense, it might be if you don't have electrical routing, then you can have a body, you can even have the neurons, but you won't be consciously alive, let's say.
But not all algorithms, when implemented, produce consciousness. So my worry is like when a brain is implementing a consciousness algorithm and a computer is implementing an algorithm simulating a conscious algorithm. They're implementing different algorithms, and the computer, the algorithm, yes, they're both implementing algorithms. The computer might not be implementing algorithms. So and I was wondering if you think, no, it actually does, just because if it simulates, it just might be
I think it could be conscious, but it also could be just a pure perception, the way like a fly. So I don't know, would you say a fly is conscious? Okay, so whatever, like if you had a computer that entirely simulated the input and output of a fly brain, then I would say that that computer is as conscious as a fly, that fly. Simulates. Yeah. So yeah, it really depends on the input output. So I don't know very much about quantum computers and the algorithms that they use. There is some question, or some people have proposed that maybe the human brain uses some sort of quantum computing to produce our conscious experience. I'm kind of 50-50 on that question. All I know is that even without zooming in all the way to the quantum level, even just looking at the more macro level of like normal atoms and ions and things like that, we already know that things like color is an algorithm. It's a computed perception. So for me, I just kind of asked the question to that level. Like maybe quantum does affect, quantum for sure affects what happens on the macro level. I do not know enough to say how, but for me, the fact that on the macro level, you already see the algorithmic nature of the brain. I'm like, whatever that is doing, okay. That's enough for me to know that if you have traditional computers using traditional computing, that could be sufficient for simulating our consciousness. It could be, yeah. I do think though, now that we know each individual person has different baseline neuronal frequencies, it's unlikely that there could be anything as specific a reward as targeting cosine 14 frequencies. But I do, like if you asked me what is currently the most likely picture of consciousness, let's say, I think it would be something like this. So I think it'd be something like a neural network looking on itself, essentially, because then you wouldn't be particularly, you wouldn't care about cosine 14 specifically across different people, but you for yourself might care about cosine 14. So we know that there's a difference between training a neural network from scratch versus taking an already trained neural network and then cutting it down. So like the difference between a 5-layer and a 6-layer network is not going to be that much different in terms of how well it does on whatever capability. But if you took a 6-layer network that has already been trained, and then you removed one of the layers, that would make a difference. Because the model was already initially trained with the 6 layers to do its thing. And then if you suddenly remove one layer, then it can no longer do the computation with that layer that it was expecting to be able to do. So I think what that means is that consciousness is probably something like a network looking on itself, in the sense of you have a base network, which we might call perception. So this is how we can sense our environments through our eyes, our ears, all the typical senses. And then in order to make sense of this large base network, you might just need to have another pattern recognition network on top of it to figure that out. And why do I think this? This actually comes from research in the AI area. So you know that we now have these really large language models or vision models or whatever, but because of the way that they are made, we don't really know what goes on in them. Like these models just look like a matrix of numbers. So the current AI models, this is what they look like internally. It's a bunch of numbers, matrices being multiplied by other numbers. And that's why people say we don't know really what's going on inside an AI, because technically we can, in a very zoomed in level, we do know what's going on. What's going on is 1.62 and minus 0.8 is being multiplied by minus 1.15 and 0.36, and then added to like minus 1.41 and minus like, in a very nitty-gritty level, yes, that is what is going on, in the same way that in a very nitty-gritty level in neuroscience, we can tell you, oh, this chemical is crossing this membrane, and then that lets electricity flow from this neuron to this other neuron. But that doesn't tell you why the more general behavior of, oh, this person decided to walk out that door versus that door. And in the same way, knowing that these numbers are multiplying things like this doesn't tell you why it's outputting the words that it does, which is not like traditional code. But anyway, the point is, because these networks are the way they are right now, a bunch of numbers, if you want to understand what is happening in this number, you basically have to try and recognize patterns in this matrix of numbers. And what that looks like is simply you are throwing another pattern recognition system on top of a base model. That's essentially what mechanistic interpretability does. So the way that they extracted this algorithm is by visualizing the activations of the model. And then they noticed, oh, you know what? These numbers are actually pretty periodic. You can see that there's some pattern here. What might that pattern be? And then if you look at conceptually what that means is you have a base model that has learned something about its environment. And then now you need a second network to kind of interpret the patterns present in the base model. So in that sense, the serial and the parallel processing, I think, is relevant because we know that with our senses, it's very capable of doing parallel processing. We can see things and hear things at the same time. We see color, we hear sound waves at the same time. But if you want to think about colors and sounds in your, let's say, mental theater, for lack of a better word, you have to kind of do that more slowly, more serially. And I think the reason why is because this second network, this thing needs to recognize the patterns of what you're seeing. And I need to look at the wall and be like, okay, that is red. That's not magenta. It's not green, it's red. And then correlate it with some other stuff happening in the environment. So if this network needs to recognize patterns in the first network, it has to operate in a serial manner because the first network has to finish its processing before the second network can be like, okay, this 0.5 over there and this 0.8 over here correspond to a color and a sound at the same time.